As I stepped inside, I responded, "It would be good to take a look, but only if it's not inconvenient for you. If you're willing, our office can send someone to inspect it later." "Oh no, no inconvenience at all. In fact, I welcome visitors. No one comes by anymore." This house used to be renowned as the mansion of the Chalan estate. Once, there were so many people, horses, elephants. What a grand life it was. I had already gathered most of this information from the office. The elderly always tend to hold on to the past, I mused. "I am the last descendant of that estate," the man continued. "As you can see, the title of estate owner means nothing now. You coming here with such an offer, it's nothing less than divine intervention. Please stay the night, have dinner with me, and you can take a proper look tomorrow." "Oh no, I must return today," I replied. "But why? If it were the old days, I would have asked you to stay for a whole month," he exclaimed, dragging the conversation back to the estate's glory days again. "And besides, it's already dusk. This is a forested area. Who knows what kind of danger might be lurking in the night?" His reasoning wasn't completely off. It was already evening, and I'd have to walk 2 miles through the forest to get back. "What's on your mind? Are you worried I might rob you and kill you in the night?" the man asked with a chuckle. I smiled at the odd comment. "No, I'm not worried about that. I don't really have anything worth stealing. I'm staying at a nearby hotel, and all my belongings are there. And nowadays, nobody carries cash. Everything's online." What I didn't mention was that I was physically fit, and it would be difficult for this frail old man to overpower me unless he had a group to help. But so far, I hadn't seen anyone else in the house. Out of curiosity, I asked him, "Do you live here alone?" "What else can I do?" he replied. "Our former tenants begged me to come live in their village with them, but how could I? With my estate blood, it wouldn't suit me to live with someone else. There was a time when even the fiercest animals wouldn't dare cross our paths, and now I can't even afford to repair the house." Oh, great. Here comes the estate talk again, I thought. The man seemed obsessed with the past, which was starting to make me uncomfortable. What made things worse was that he would occasionally stare at me with an unblinking gaze in the middle of our conversation. "Come, let me show you where you'll be sleeping," he said. "The room isn't in great condition, but it will have to do. And for dinner, it's just plain rice and lentils, nothing fancy." "Oh, don't worry about that," I said, trying to sound polite. "I would have shown you the house today, but it's pitch dark in some parts. You wouldn't be able to see anything. In the old days, chandeliers used to light up every corner of this place." No doubt, I thought, the man had probably spent too much time alone and was starting to lose touch with reality. Every conversation returned to his estate days. After dinner, I went to my room to sleep. The room wasn't too bad, though the door had no latch, which made me a bit uneasy. But at least I was sure this wasn't a haunted house. There was a large picture of Lord Krishna in my room, and I'd seen an image of Lord Shiva in his room. I had never heard of any ghost story involving a house with pictures of deities hanging in the rooms. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a sense of unease. At first, I couldn't figure out why I had woken up. But then I felt it. Someone else was in the room. My skin crawled at the thought. Slowly, I half opened my eyes, and what I saw left me stunned. The old man was standing next to my bed, hunched over. In the dim candlelight from the next room, I could see he was watching me closely, scrutinizing every movement. I prepared myself mentally, ready to fight back if he attacked, but nothing happened. After a few moments, he quietly left the room, closing the door gently behind him. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. It was clear that the man had some serious mental health issues. Thankfully, he seemed harmless, but still, it was unnerving. The next morning, after freshening up, I met with him again before leaving. His face and demeanor were completely normal, showing no signs of the strange behavior from the night before. For a moment, I considered mentioning it, but decided against it. I was just minutes away from leaving this place anyway. He didn't wait for me to ask about the house. "Come, let me show you the Chalan estate mansion," he said. "Once you see the house, you'll understand the extent of our family's glory. The estate blood still runs in my veins, though fate has dealt me a cruel hand." Oh no, not this again, I thought, as I followed him around the mansion. The place was indeed massive. There was a ballroom, a courtroom, a playroom, and even a prayer hall. Though I wasn't particularly interested in these details, I nodded along out of courtesy. Finally, we reached a room that was pitch dark, even in broad daylight. Standing in front of the door, I was hit by a foul stench. The door itself was strange, thick iron with a small square opening in the middle, like something out of a prison movie. "This is the cowshed," he said. The smell made sense now, but I was surprised to see a cowshed inside the house. "Step inside. You'll find it fascinating," he urged. Though I had no interest in seeing it, I stepped in to humor him, fearing he might change his mind about selling at the last moment. The room was small, but what struck me was a heavy iron gate at the far end, operated by a pulley system from above. As I stared at it in confusion, I suddenly heard a noise behind me. As I turned around, I saw the old man standing in the doorway, a cold smile spreading across his face. Before I could react, the heavy iron gate at the far end of the room began to descend with a loud, clanging noise. It was being lowered by the pulley system, and I was trapped inside. "What? What are you doing?" I stammered, my voice shaking. The old man's smile widened, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling mix of excitement and madness. He didn't respond immediately, simply watching as the gate sealed shut with a metallic thud, leaving me in the dim light of the cramped room. "This room," he finally spoke, his voice low and eerie, "it used to be a dungeon. During the days of the estate's glory, it was where we kept prisoners, those who dared defy the estate. The bloodline, it demands sacrifices." I felt my heart pound in my chest. The whole atmosphere of the house, the strange behavior of the old man, and now this dungeon, it all added up to something deeply wrong. "I don't understand," I tried to say calmly, though panic was creeping into my voice. "I thought we were talking about the estate's restoration, about the sale." "Sale? Restoration?" he said, almost laughing now. No, you misunderstand. The estate must be preserved, the glory must return. And you've come here at the perfect time." I tried to push against the gate, but it was solid iron, impossible to move. I had no phone signal in this remote area, no way to call for help. "Let me out," I demanded, my voice growing more desperate. The old man just stood there, watching me with that same unsettling grin. "Don't worry," he said softly. "It will all be over soon." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to notice something horrifying in the corner of the room. Bones. Old, decayed bones, some human, others animal. My stomach turned, and a wave of nausea hit me as the realization set in. I wasn't the first person to be brought here. "You see," the man continued, "the estate demands blood. For generations, we've made sure to feed it, to keep its spirit alive. But as the years passed and the people left, the sacrifices became fewer. Now, only I remained to carry out the old ways." He started walking closer, his frail frame suddenly menacing in the dim light. "But don't worry, you'll be remembered in the history of this place. Your blood will help restore the estate's former glory. You'll become part of something grand." I was out of options. My mind raced, trying to think of a way to escape. Suddenly, I remembered the old man's obsession with the past, with the estate's glory. Perhaps I could use that to my advantage. "Wait," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. "You're right, the estate's glory must be preserved. But killing me won't help. You need someone to restore it, to tell the world about its greatness." He paused, narrowing his eyes. "You said it yourself. No one visits anymore. But if you let me go, I can tell the world. I work for a company that restores estates just like this one. We can bring people back, make the estate known again. You'll be remembered as the one who brought it back to life, not as some forgotten hermit." For a moment, the old man seemed to consider my words. His grip on the past was strong, and his desire to see the estate restored was genuine, if twisted. You can bring people back?" he asked, doubt and hope flickering in his voice. "Yes," I lied. "I can bring people, wealth, everything. But if you kill me, none of that will happen. The estate will die with you." He stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Finally, his shoulders slumped and the manic energy drained from his face. I never wanted this," he muttered. "I only wanted to see the estate flourish again." "Then let me help," I urged, keeping my voice steady. After another long pause, he sighed deeply. With trembling hands, he reached for the pulley system and began to lift the iron gate. It creaked as it rose, allowing me to step out of the room, my heart still pounding in my chest. "Go," he said, his voice weak. "Go and bring back the estate's glory." I didn't waste a second. I bolted past him, not looking back, and sprinted out of the mansion. The cool night air hit my face as I ran through the overgrown yard, away from the dark, decaying house. I didn't stop running until I was far from the mansion, the outline of the house barely visible in the distance. Only when I was sure I was safe did I slow down, gasping for breath. I never returned to that place. I never filed a report with my company, and I never told anyone about what happened. The estate was a relic of the past, forgotten by time, and it was better that way. Whatever haunted that place, whether it was madness or something else, should remain buried in the shadows where it belonged. The terror of the Yeti. After finishing my job, I was thinking about what to do at home. I saw an advertisement in the newspaper for a good job in a World Bank project. Without thinking much, I applied for it. A few days later, I received a call. I had an interview at the World Bank in Delhi. I passed that too and got a posting in Bhutan. My office in Thimphu is for an illuminator. At the top, there's a Japanese director, followed by 3 deputy directors, 1 Chinese, 1 Japanese, and 1 Indian. We have 5 illuminators, including me, 2 Indian men, 1 Korean woman, 1 Chinese woman, and the 5th is a Bangladeshi woman. Gradually, I got to know everyone. They were all highly educated, except for me. My job was to travel around various banks and evaluate loans. The Bangladeshi woman holds a doctorate in economics and reviews the bank's development. The others are also experts in different fields. Bhutan can be roughly divided into 4 parts. In the south is the Nepalese majority town of Phuent Choling, which has a larger population. There are some industries, and rice, potatoes, vegetables, and trading are the main sources of income. In the west is Samtsin Dupa, with residents predominantly from the Dupa community. Agriculture and forestry are the main sources of income here. In the west, Chimakothi has the Budia and Mek tribes, who excel in traditional weaving. The north is extremely cold, home to Tibetans and Dupas. In the central part of the country, around Paro Valley, Bhutanese people generally reside. They are quite affluent, with beautiful wooden houses and a variety of flowers. There are different kinds of food. Our office is in the capital Thimphu. I live in a flat behind it. Dr. Anwara, the Bangladeshi woman, is my neighbor. I spend time chatting with her after work. Her daughter is a doctor in Rajshahi. She is very serious and visits various women's development projects, praising their efforts. This way, my time passes. Though I have visited various places, I hadn't been to the north. This time, I received orders to go north. It takes a day to get from Thimphu to the main city, Drangchu. Anwara Madam accompanied me. Exiting Thimphu, the scenery changed to pine forests, beautiful wooden houses of the Dupa community, and gardens of apples, oranges, and cherries. The roads were clean, and the sky was blue with scattered clouds. There were fields of potato, wheat, and rice, dense jungles of pine, cedar, and rhododendron. Gradually, the scenery began to change. Small shrubs appeared, and then higher up, a dense fog covered the wet ground with small ferns and numerous wildflower plants. After that, we entered a snowy realm and arrived at a small Bhutanese Tibetan town called Drangchu. Drangchu is extraordinary. To the north lies a massive glacier with a snowy river flowing down. Deep mountains and dense forests surround us on 3 sides. Across the way is the Lhasa Valley in Tibet. To the east is the Saktan Forest, known as the habitat of Yeti. Beyond that is the Tawang region of Arunachal Pradesh, India. It's a small settlement where the residents are from the Drupka, Tibetan community, cultivating rice, millet, barley, and potatoes. They also raise yaks. Chamrigai is another source of income. Their handicrafts and woodcraft are exported abroad. Everyone lives in wooden or slate stone houses, well kept and neat. They are very hospitable. Surprisingly, the literacy rate is around 90%. In the middle of the village is a gompa, beside which is the king's office, a school, and a dispensary. They have a royal representative who is also a ruler. His 2-storied house is made of stone and wood. He warmly welcomed us into his home. The living room was adorned with expensive carpets and intricately carved wooden furniture. His daughter came in and surprised us by speaking broken Bangla. She had completed her MA at North Bengal University. She is the headmistress of the local school. She took us to the Gampa, a massive slate stone structure with huge frescoes inside. In the center was a golden statue of Buddha, flanked by statues of lotus and the ancestors of present-day Bhutan. In the middle of the Gampa was a large wooden box containing a preserved Yeti body. I learned that only 3 Yeti bodies have been found in the world, 2 in Tibet and this one here. We paid our respects to the chief lama. That day, we stayed at the government guest house. The next day, our meeting began. There are only 2 banks in this area, and I collected reports from them. I found that loan recovery was very good. I heard the same from Madam. Here, the women's self-help group has a 100% recovery rate. They gave us jackets made from yak skin and musk deer musk. Outside the Gampa, a small group of Swedish women had set up a camp. They came to the Sakten Reserve in search of some valuable trees. There's also an extremely valuable root herb found in this region, whose extract is known for enhancing strength and is sold at a high price abroad. It can be found above Sakten Forest, where clouds reign all year round. Yeti sightings still occur in those areas. Here, there is a belief that encountering a Yeti means certain death. Some people have been injured in Yeti attacks. That Swedish group likely came in search of Yetis, although they claim to be testing the ginseng herb. The local ruler's daughter, Doma, will accompany them. I struck up a friendship with Doma and requested the ruler to let me join them. Initially reluctant, they eventually agreed since it would take 3 to 4 days. Madam returned to Thimphu. The next day, we set out early. 5 Swedish women, Doma and I, along with a guide, a hunter, and 6 porters, set off on 7 or 8 horses and mules. July is summer there with a clear blue sky. We began climbing through a narrow trail inside a pine forest. Below, there were huge fern trees and a variety of unknown flowers. After about 4 hours, we found a small pond with blue water. I saw some lotus flowers blooming, and 2 cranes were swimming. From the top of the mountain, a vast distance could be seen below. The pine jungle appeared hazy. We had lunch at this spot. I chatted with Doma a bit. I found it hard to understand how the Swedish women spoke English. What I gathered was that they were professors of botany and anthropology in Copenhagen and had come to Bhutan to conduct some research in these inaccessible jungles. We started climbing again through the narrow path. The dense jungle gradually thinned out, and we emerged into a clear area. It was evident that people had come here before, as there were signs of cooking. The Sherpas formed a circle and set up a tent, lighting a fire in the center. Doma wanted to sleep in my tent. We had to share a sleeping bag in the tent with 4 people. The Swedish women brought tin food. We enjoyed some games with the Sherpas. It started to snow after sunset, and we lay in the tent, chatting under the battery lantern. Doma's father is the royal representative of the Drangchu region, enjoying immense prestige. Doma excelled in her studies, completing her BA in Thimphu and then enrolling in an MA in English at North Bengal University. There, she fell in love with a Bhutanese Nepali boy. After completing her MA, against her father's wishes, she married him. The boy lived in Phuntsholing and took a job there, but their relationship did not go well. Meanwhile, the expulsion of Nepalis from Bhutan began. Doma's husband's family was also expelled and moved to the Japa camp in Nepal, where he married a rich businessman's daughter and divorced Doma. Her father then transferred Doma to Drangchu. She has been here ever since. I asked her why, being so beautiful and educated, she hasn't remarried. She replied, "I haven't thought about it. If I feel like it, I will." Amidst the intense cold, I fell asleep to the Sherpas' incomprehensible songs outside. I could sense that it was snowing all night. Around dawn, I heard a distant sound, much like a conch shell. I realized something terrifying was happening as I heard the loud chanting from the Sherpas' tent. In the morning, I saw that the sky had cleared considerably. The entire area, along with our tent, was covered in snow. We quickly got ready and climbed up a bit. A place had been cleared, and we saw several tents, horses, and mules. A couple of people were cooking. They warned us about Yeti sightings, advising us to be careful. We started to move, but an unknown fear was creeping in. The Sherpas were visibly anxious. They mentioned that the Yeti had attacked a few days ago. They said they had seen a group of tourists in a secluded spot of the mountain, and that group had never returned. The Sherpas were chanting, perhaps as a means to protect themselves against the fear. Stepping outside the tent, I felt a rush of relief, seeing the first light of dawn. But that relief didn't last long. The ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow, as if the world had been shrouded in a vast white sheet. We all gathered our gear and made our way to an open area where some Sherpas were preparing breakfast. They warned us to stay alert on the trail. After some discussion with Doma, we decided to move forward cautiously, trying to reach a safer location. Slowly, we began our ascent. As we walked, I occasionally glanced back, feeling as if some unseen eyes were watching us. Suddenly, Doma pointed out, "Look, I see a deep shadow over there on the trees." I turned to look. Indeed, in the distance, a large shadow caught my eye. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. What if the Yeti came after us? After walking for a bit, Doma sent one of the Sherpas ahead to fetch supplies. He was going to bring back some food and water for us. Doma agreed, but I felt a surge of worry in my gut. After the Sherpa left, Doma and I exchanged nervous glances. After a while, suddenly, a scream echoed from behind us. Everyone panicked. Doma exclaimed, "What was that?" I stood frozen, but fear coursed through my veins, making every muscle tense. "Look!" Doma shouted. I turned around and saw the Sherpa running toward us, his eyes wide with terror. "Yeti! Yeti!" he cried. We began to run, but before I could even start moving, I saw that enormous shadow coming toward us. Slowly, it became clear. A massive, terrifying Yeti was advancing. Its long, thick fur and piercing eyes were fixed on us. Doma dashed behind a rock for cover, but I was rooted to the spot. For some unknown reason, I couldn't move. The Yeti was now just a few meters away, its heavy footsteps crunching on the frozen snow. "Back!" Doma shouted, but I couldn't hear him. All my attention was drawn to the Yeti. Suddenly, the Yeti approached, its large fists clenched. Doma ran to hide behind a tree, but I was unsure of what to do. It felt as if time had stopped. I realized that if I could escape at that moment, I might survive. But where could I run? Snow and rocks surrounded us, and that terrifying Yeti was closing in. I tried to back away slowly, but my foot caught on a rock, and I fell. "Watch out!" Doma yelled, but just then, the Yeti noticed me. It turned and stared directly at me. I was dumbfounded. Was it reacting out of fear? Moments later, the Yeti began to run. It seemed to be trying to escape from us. I looked at Doma, who was just as bewildered. "What do we do now?" I shouted. "Let's get out of here quickly," Doma replied. We both started to sprint towards a cave nearby. Inside the cave, darkness enveloped us, but we could still hear the sounds around us, the Yeti's footsteps. "We should wait here for a moment," Doma suggested. "Why? What if it finds us?" I asked, my heart racing. "It seems to have lost interest in us." "We need to be smart about this," Doma replied, trying to keep calm. We crouched in the cave, our breaths heavy in the cold air. The sounds outside grew quieter, but we could still hear faint noises. It felt like a lifetime before we heard anything else. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash, followed by a growl from outside the cave. "Is it coming back?" I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "I don't know. We have to be very quiet," Doma said, his eyes wide with fear. Just then, the growl became louder, and I could see a shadow moving closer to the entrance of the cave. My heart raced as I prepared for the worst. We held our breath as the shadow loomed over us, blocking out the faint light. In the darkness, we could only hope that whatever creature it was would move on. Then the growl stopped, and we heard footsteps retreating. "What just happened?" I asked, bewildered. "I think it got distracted. We might have a chance to slip away," Doma whispered back, a glimmer of hope in his voice. "Do you think we should try?" I asked hesitantly. "Yes, but we must be silent. Follow my lead," Doma said, and we slowly began to creep toward the cave's entrance. "What happens next? Let me know how you'd like to proceed." We edged closer to the cave entrance, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The air felt thick with tension, and every tiny sound seemed amplified. Doma gestured for me to follow him as we cautiously stepped into the dim light outside. The world around us was eerily quiet. I glanced back into the cave, half expecting the Yeti to come charging after us. But the darkness behind us remained still, almost as if it were holding its breath. "Let's head downhill," Doma whispered, motioning toward a narrow path that led away from the cave. "We might find the others or a safer place." We began to move quickly but quietly, skirting the edges of the rocky terrain. As we made our way down, the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting long shadows on the snow. The landscape, though beautiful, felt menacing under the circumstances. Suddenly, Doma stopped dead in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears and heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Panic surged through me. What if it's the Yeti? "Stay low," Doma instructed, crouching down behind a boulder. I followed suit, trying to control my breathing. We waited in silence as the footsteps grew louder. To our horror, a massive figure emerged from the tree line. A Yeti. It was massive, its fur glistening under the sun as it plodded forward, seemingly oblivious to our presence. "Do you think it's looking for us?" I whispered. Doma shook his head. "I don't know, but we can't stick around to find out." He looked around frantically, searching for an escape route. As the Yeti continued on its path, Doma spotted a thicket of trees nearby. "We can hide there," he said, pointing urgently. Without a second thought, we both crawled toward the thicket, moving as silently as possible. We squeezed ourselves between the thick trunks and branches, barely able to breathe. The Yeti lumbered past us, and I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. I risked a glance outside, and my stomach dropped as I locked eyes with the creature. It stopped, turning its massive head toward our hiding spot. My breath hitched in my throat, and Doma motioned for me to stay still. The Yeti sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and I could see the sharp, menacing teeth glinting in the light. Then, as if losing interest, the Yeti turned away, continuing its lumbering journey. We stayed hidden for what felt like an eternity, our bodies tense with fear and adrenaline. Finally, Doma broke the silence. "We need to find the others and get out of here. This isn't safe." "Do you think they're still at camp?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Maybe, but we should also consider that they might have left. If we can find a way to signal for help or find shelter, we should do that first." We emerged from our hiding spot, scanning the area for any signs of the other trekkers. The path before us seemed clear, but every rustle of the trees made my heart race. "Look!" Doma pointed toward a series of footprints leading down a different trail. "Those could be ours or someone else's. Let's follow them." We cautiously followed the prints, hoping they belonged to our group. After a few minutes, we reached a clearing, and to our relief, we spotted the remains of the camp, a few tents still standing. "Over there!" I exclaimed, pointing toward the tents. As we approached, a sudden shout made us jump. "Doma! Over here!" It was one of the Sherpas. Relief flooded over us as we rushed toward him. "Where's everyone else?" Doma asked, breathless. "They scattered when the Yeti appeared. We need to regroup," the Sherpa said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Regroup? How can we? The Yeti could be anywhere," I protested, fear creeping back into my chest. "We need to make noise and signal for them," Doma suggested. "We'll make a fire. That will attract them and keep us warm." We hurried to gather branches and dry leaves to start a fire. As Doma worked to spark a flame, I glanced around, listening intently for any sign of the Yeti or the other trekkers. With a few quick strikes, Doma managed to ignite a small fire. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows around us. "Now we wait," he said, trying to sound confident. But the wait felt interminable. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch sent jolts of anxiety through me. What if the Yeti returned? What if we couldn't find the others? Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Just when I thought hope was lost, I heard voices approaching. "This way," came a familiar call. "Over here," Doma shouted back, and soon enough, our fellow trekkers stumbled into the clearing, disheveled but alive. "Thank goodness we found you," one of them exclaimed. "We thought we were the only ones left." After quick introductions, we formed a circle around the fire, sharing what we knew. "We need to stay together and keep watch," Doma said, taking charge. "The Yeti could return at any moment." As night fell, we sat around the fire, telling stories to keep our spirits up. But the tension was palpable. I could feel the dread lingering in the air, knowing that the Yeti could attack again. Just then, a loud roar echoed from the mountainside, sending chills down my spine. The fire crackled as we all froze, exchanging terrified glances. "Did you hear that?" one of the trekkers whispered. "Yes," I replied, trying to remain calm. "It's closer than before." Doma stood up, his expression grim. "We need to split up into two groups. One will stay here and keep watch while the other searches for a safer location." Are you sure that's a good idea? I asked, my voice shaking. It's the only chance we have, he insisted. We'll have to stay alert. Whoever's on watch must keep an eye out for the Yeti. Reluctantly, we agreed. As the groups were formed, a palpable tension hung in the air. We all understood the risk of being caught unprepared. As the night deepened, my heart raced. I was part of the watch group, and every sound made me jump. The wind howled and the fire flickered. Suddenly, I heard a low growl emanating from the darkness beyond the firelight. Did you hear that? One of my companions whispered, eyes wide with fear. Stay quiet, Doma ordered, peering into the shadows. We strained our ears, trying to make sense of the ominous sounds. Then, with terrifying clarity, the Yeti emerged from the trees, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlight. It was closer than before, and fear gripped me. Everyone, stand back! Doma shouted, trying to remain calm. We need to protect ourselves. We scrambled for anything we could use as a weapon, sticks, stones, anything to defend ourselves. The Yeti roared again, a sound that shook the very ground beneath us. In a moment of desperation, I threw a rock at the creature, but it barely fazed it. The Yeti turned its attention toward me, eyes glowing with a primal fury. Panic flooded through me, and I stumbled backward, but Doma was quick to react. Run! We have to get away! He shouted. As we fled, the Yeti charged after us, its powerful strides echoing in the night. I could hear the heavy thuds of its footsteps, each one feeling like a countdown to disaster. We dashed through the trees, adrenaline pumping through our veins. My heart raced as we weaved through the underbrush, the firelight fading behind us. Where do we go? I yelled, desperation creeping into my voice. Up the hill, Doma shouted. We need higher ground. We reached a steep incline and climbed frantically, the snow beneath us slipping away as we fought against gravity. The sounds of the Yeti grew fainter behind us, but I knew it wouldn't give up easily. Finally, we reached a rocky outcrop and collapsed behind a large boulder, panting heavily. We could hear the Yeti roaring in the distance, searching for us. As we caught our breath, I turned to Doma. What now? We can't just stay here forever. We wait for morning, Doma replied, his voice steady despite the chaos we had just escaped. We can't risk going back down while it's still dark. I nodded, though the idea of waiting filled me with dread. The night seemed endless, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. Hours passed, and I struggled to stay awake. I could hear Doma softly murmuring to himself, perhaps trying to soothe his nerves. Suddenly, I saw a flicker of light in the distance, a faint glow that seemed to be moving. Doma, look, I whispered, pointing toward the light. He squinted into the darkness. It could be a rescue team, he said, hope flooding his voice. We need to signal them. I nodded, desperate to get their attention. We found some loose rocks and began to throw them down the slope, hoping the noise would attract the light. Please let them see us, I murmured, fear gnawing at my insides. Just as we were about to lose hope, the light grew brighter, and soon we heard shouts from below. This way! Over here! My heart leapt with joy, and I started waving my arms frantically. Doma joined in, and we called out, our voices hoarse from the night's strain. The figures drew closer, and as they reached us, we realized it was a group of Sherpas and fellow trekkers, armed with torches and gear. We thought we'd lost you, one of them exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. We were searching for you. The Yeti, I gasped, trying to explain. It was chasing us. Let's get to safety, Doma urged. We can't linger here. We hurried down the hill together, the light from the torches illuminating our path. The thought of the Yeti still haunted me, but with the group now gathered, I felt a renewed sense of safety. As we made our way back toward the campsite, the morning sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. It felt surreal, knowing that we had survived the night. I can't believe we made it, I said, breathing in the fresh morning air. Doma looked at me, a grin spreading across his face. We're not out of the woods yet, but we've got each other, and that's what counts. With a renewed sense of hope, we returned to the campsite and shared our harrowing tale with the others. The Yeti might still be lurking in the shadows, but we were determined to face it together, united as a group. As we gathered supplies and prepared to move, a familiar roar echoed from the mountainside, sending chills down my spine. Stay alert, Doma commanded, his face hardening. We can't let our guard down now. The trepidation hung in the air as we made our way out of the camp, ready to confront the unknown together. The group moved cautiously, eyes scanning the dense trees for any sign of the Yeti. The atmosphere felt charged with tension. Every snapped twig or rustle of leaves set my heart racing. We trekked onward, determination fueling our steps. "We need to reach higher ground," Doma suggested, leading the way. "We can get a better view and see if the Yeti is following us." We climbed a steep incline, our legs burning from exertion. As we reached the top, we paused to catch our breath and survey the landscape below. The sun had risen fully, illuminating the beauty of the snow-covered mountains, but it felt overshadowed by our fear. "Look," one of the Sherpas pointed. "There, in the valley below." We all turned to see a massive shape moving through the snow, its white fur blending with the landscape. The Yeti was pacing, seemingly searching for something or someone. Doma's expression hardened. "We have to find a way to distract it. If we can get it away from the camp, we can make our escape." The group quickly brainstormed a plan. One of the Sherpas suggested using a series of loud noises to draw the Yeti away. We gathered rocks and sticks, preparing to make a commotion. "On the count of 3, Doma instructed, "we throw everything we have." We all nodded, adrenaline coursing through our veins. 1, 2, 3. We hurled our makeshift weapons down the slope, the sounds echoing against the mountainside. The Yeti's head snapped up, its eyes narrowing as it turned in our direction. "Now! Let's go!" Doma shouted, leading us back down the hill. We raced down the path, the sound of our feet pounding against the snow mingling with the distant roar of the Yeti. As we reached the tree line, we could see the Yeti chasing after us, its massive form moving quickly across the snow. Panic surged through me as we ran, but we pressed on, driven by the instinct to survive. "Head for that cabin!" one of the Sherpas shouted, pointing toward a small structure nestled among the trees. It looked abandoned, but offered a chance of shelter. We barreled toward the cabin, our hearts pounding with every step. The Yeti was gaining on us, its growls echoing in the air. We reached the cabin, pushing through the door just in time. Inside, the air was stale, and the dim light revealed dust and cobwebs. We barricaded the door with anything we could find, old furniture, crates, anything to buy us some time. "Is it locked?" I panted, looking at Doma. He nodded, breathing heavily. "For now, yes, but we need to find something to defend ourselves with." We searched the cabin frantically, finding a few old tools and a rusty axe. "This will have to do," Doma said, gripping the axe tightly. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside. The Yeti was here. It pounded against the door, shaking the structure to its core. My heart raced as I looked around, desperately searching for an escape route. "We can't hold it off forever," one of the trekkers cried, panic evident in his voice. "We need to find a way to distract it again," Doma said, his mind racing. "If we can lure it away from here, we can make a break for it." Just then, I spotted a window at the back of the cabin. "What if we make noise outside and then slip out the back?" I suggested, hoping it would work. "Good idea," Doma replied. "We'll create a distraction and sneak out while it's focused on the noise." We quickly gathered more materials to make a loud racket outside. Doma and I creaked open the back door, careful not to make a sound. "On 3, he whispered. 1, 2, 3. We tossed rocks and shouted, trying to attract the Yeti's attention. The beast turned, roaring furiously as it charged toward the noise. "Now, go!" Doma yelled, and we slipped out of the cabin, hearts racing. As we ran, the sound of the Yeti's growls faded behind us. We made our way through the trees, adrenaline surging as we pushed ourselves to move faster. We stumbled upon a small creek, its icy waters glistening in the morning sun. "This way," Doma pointed, leading us along the bank, hoping to stay out of sight. "We need to find a way to get off this mountain," I said, panic starting to rise again. After a few moments of running, we spotted a path leading down into the valley. "Let's go," Doma urged, and we followed him down the slope. The path was steep and treacherous, but we pressed on, fear driving us forward. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the valley floor. Ahead, we could see a group of rescuers, their shouts growing louder as they searched for us. "There they are," one of them shouted, waving frantically. "We're here!" I cried, relief flooding through me as we rushed toward them. The rescuers quickly surrounded us, checking for injuries and assuring us we were safe. "We thought we lost you," one of the team leaders exclaimed. "We were getting worried." Doma turned to the group, his face filled with exhaustion. "The Yeti is real," he said, voice shaking. "We need to warn everyone." As we recounted our harrowing tale, the rescuers listened intently, their expressions turning serious. "We need to ensure everyone is safe," one of them said. "We'll send out search teams to monitor the area." With renewed determination, we set out together to regroup with the rest of our trekking party. The sun was now high in the sky, and the shadows of the mountains felt less ominous. As we approached the camp, the feeling of safety returned, though the memory of the Yeti still lingered. We would need to stay vigilant, but for now, we were alive. In the days that followed, we made our way down the mountain, our bond stronger than ever. The Yeti remained a haunting memory, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the wild. As we returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter with the creature had changed us. We had faced fear and emerged stronger, united by our shared experience. Months later, as I sat by the fire, I thought back to that harrowing night. The Yeti had become a part of my story, a reminder of resilience and the strength found in unity. And while I may never want to cross paths with that creature again, I knew that the adventure would always be a part of me. Beneath the shrouded moon. It was late at night when I finished my tutoring session and started my journey back home. The fields surrounding me were flooded, with parts of the road submerged in murky water. Despite the heavy rainfall, the need for extra income kept me from skipping my evening classes. With a flashlight in hand, I carefully placed my feet on the waterlogged path, making my way cautiously. The road stretched for almost half a kilometer through the heart of a desolate meadow. In such weather, no humans ventured out, let alone animals. During the dry days, a dog would always follow me home, tail wagging in delight. After each tutoring session, he would trot alongside me, and by the time I reached my house, he would gobble up his food and then curl up outside to sleep. But now, it had been days since I had last seen him. Perhaps he had gotten stuck somewhere due to the flooding. I tried to keep my mind occupied, battling the unease that began creeping in. The desolate landscape around me had a way of conjuring dreadful thoughts. What if there were venomous snakes writhing beneath the water? Or worse, what if a massive crocodile was lurking nearby, ready to pounce? To fend off the chilling thoughts, I began humming a tune, my voice echoing into the vast emptiness of the meadow. After all, no one was around to hear me. Yes, my heart is. I sang, feeling a little braver. Suddenly, the beam of my flashlight caught something in the distance, reflecting off a large bell tree at the bend of the road. The tree stood tall, its gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. In this waterlogged kingdom, it stood alone, as if waiting to consume me. I realized that traversing this stretch of road while keeping my mind distracted was a daunting task. From a young age, I had heard terrifying tales about this very place. In the past, this spot had been used to dispose of dead livestock, what we called a dump. My grandmother would recount stories of people who would come upon a deceased calf or a cow at night, frozen in fear. Or sometimes they would find themselves confronted by an ominous, lifeless animal standing in the middle of the road. Those who ventured closer, tempted by the thought of taking the dead animal home, would often run madly after it until they collapsed, exhausted, in the middle of the street. I had also heard from some elderly neighbors that this land was cursed. Many believed it stemmed from an old woman who had died after consuming poison nearby. Since then, a dark shadow had settled over the area. All these thoughts weighed heavily on my mind. I could recall countless nights when the road had been bustling with life, even past midnight. It was strange to feel such a deep-rooted fear in this isolated place. Just as I was grappling with my thoughts, a sudden rustling behind me startled me. The noise of splashing feet drew closer, breaking the silence I had grown accustomed to. I turned around to find two glowing eyes darting toward me, accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing. I shone my flashlight in that direction, and relief flooded through me as I recognized the familiar form of my lost dog. He was splashing through the water, his tail wagging as he approached me. It seemed he had exhausted himself trying to catch up with me. He stood by my side for a moment, panting heavily. As I was about to say something comforting, he nudged me with his head, urging me forward. I was taken aback. He had never done that before. When I paused, the dog became more insistent, pushing me gently with his snout, as if he sensed something was off. Frustrated, I exclaimed, "Hey, what's wrong with you? You're going to make me fall." At that, the dog looked up, its gaze piercing as it barked fiercely. I followed his line of sight, turning the flashlight toward the bell tree. I was shocked to find myself standing beneath the tree without realizing it. As the beam of light illuminated the branches, I froze, my blood running cold. Hanging from one of the tree's thin limbs was a body draped in tattered clothing, its hair tangled and wild. The face was obscured, and the mere thought of what lay hidden beneath that mass of hair sent shivers down my spine. The dog started growling low and deep, the sound resonating through the night air. The body swung gently, almost mockingly, as if alive. My heart raced, and I felt as if a swarm of insects was crawling through my veins. In a moment of horror, the body began to sway, and I realized that it was not merely hanging there. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground as the dog urged me forward again, now more frantically. Suddenly, I felt a heavy thud against my feet. The sound of something crashing into the water echoed in the stillness of the night. In that instant, I couldn't bear to look back. I took off running, the flashlight clattering in my hand, illuminating the path ahead. I ran with all my might, gathering every ounce of strength within me. I could hear the water splashing behind me, my heart racing with panic. I glanced back, realizing the dog was no longer at my side, his frantic barks echoing faintly in the distance. Ignoring the pain in my legs, I pressed on, refusing to stop. I could hear the splashes intensifying, accompanied by the dog's desperate whimpers. I fought against the instinct to turn around, knowing that I had to escape. I stumbled into my home, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The echoes of that night haunted me as I struggled to catch my breath. The following morning, I prepared myself to head back to the tutoring session, convinced that the previous night had been a figment of my imagination. The sun shone brightly, dispelling the darkness that had enveloped the landscape. However, as I approached the bell tree, dread filled my heart. My worst fears were confirmed as I laid eyes on the scene before me. There, floating beneath the tree, was the lifeless body of a dog. Its belly was swollen, and the stark contrast of its black fur against the ground sent a wave of nausea over me. But the most disturbing part was that the dog was not the same one I had known. Its ribcage was protruding, evidence that it had been dead for days, long before I had seen it last. The horror of the night before came crashing back, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. As I stood there, the weight of the past clung to me like a shadow, reminding me that some stories are best left untold, and some places are haunted by more than just memories. The summoning of Vincent. Moving to a new town wasn't easy for Rachel. Middlebury, a small and quiet town, felt a world away from the busy life she'd known. As she walked the halls of Midwood High, a strange sense of discomfort seemed to follow her. There was something off about this place, something she couldn't put her finger on. Her friends, Sarah, Liz, and Tom, were the only thing that kept her sane. Together, they tried to make the best of their small-town life. It wasn't long before they heard about him. Vincent, a name no one dared say too often. A boy who, to this day, haunted the minds of those who knew him. His story was one of urban legend, a tale passed down among students to scare each other. But Rachel soon learned that the legend wasn't far from the truth. Vincent had attended Midwood High a few years before Rachel moved to town. He was an odd kid, always lurking in the background, silent, staring with an unsettling intensity. He never had friends. His eyes were often hidden behind dark, round sunglasses, and his skin was so pale it seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights of the school. He wore the same dark green hoodie every day, one that smelled of sweat and grime, never washed. People whispered about how he claimed to be something otherworldly. A demon, Sarah had whispered to Rachel one day after class. He said he wasn't human, that he was from the other side. Rachel rolled her eyes at first. Another high school weirdo. Every school had one, right? But the more she heard about him, the more uneasy she became. According to Liz, who was always up on the town gossip, Vincent would walk up to random students and declare them adopted into his strange personal circle. It was his way of protecting you, Liz explained, shivering. He said that if he adopted you, you were safe from him. As time passed, Rachel couldn't shake the growing feeling of dread. She began to notice the empty stares of students who had apparently been adopted by Vincent. They weren't the same. They avoided eye contact, stuck to the shadows, and whispered amongst themselves in hushed tones, like they were in on some dark secret. One afternoon, as Rachel and her friends hung out behind the school, they joked about the rumors. Sarah, always the skeptic, scoffed at the idea of Vincent having any real power. Tom, trying to lighten the mood, chimed in. You know, if you say his name 3 times, he appears, right? That's ridiculous, Rachel laughed. There's no way that's true. Why don't we try it? Sarah teased. Come on, let's see if this demon of yours shows up. Despite her better judgment, Rachel agreed. They all said his name, Vincent, 3 times, half joking, half nervous. The words echoed into the quiet evening air. At first, nothing happened. They all exchanged relieved, if not slightly embarrassed, glances. Then, without warning, they heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel behind them. Slowly, they turned, and there he was, Vincent. He stood silently, just a few feet away, staring at them with a hollow expression. His hood was pulled low over his eyes, but the outline of his figure was unmistakable. A baseball bat rested loosely in his hands. No one spoke. The tension was suffocating. Vincent tilted his head slightly, acknowledging Rachel, then turned and walked away as silently as he had arrived. Sarah's nervous laughter broke the silence, but Rachel couldn't join in. Something about the encounter left her shaken. The next few days passed without incident, and the group brushed off the strange encounter. Rachel, though, couldn't shake the feeling that they had stirred something dark. One night, while hanging out at Liz's house, they casually talked about Vincent again. Liz's mother, who had grown up in Middlebury, told them that she remembered Vincent well. She said his presence always made her uncomfortable, and that something about him felt wrong. People said he could appear when his name was called, Liz's mom mused, almost like a curse. They said it was dangerous to even speak about him. Liz and Rachel laughed it off, but that night as they slept in Liz's room, they heard a loud bang from downstairs. They ran to the living room, only to find Vincent standing just inside the door, talking softly to Liz's mom. When Liz asked him what he was doing there, his reply was chilling. You summoned me. Liz's mom told him to leave, and Vincent obeyed, but the strange look he gave Rachel as he walked out stayed with her for days. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if his eyes were constantly on her, even when she was alone. Things escalated quickly after that. It seemed no matter where she was, if Vincent's name was mentioned, he would appear. Once at school, then again when she was alone in the park. His presence was never violent, but it was always menacing. And each time, he seemed to get closer, more confident in his silent torment. Then, the night came that Rachel would never forget. It was storming outside, heavy rain pounding on the roof as thunder roared in the distance. Rachel had been on edge all day, and now, alone in her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom. Dare you to say his name? Rachel hesitated, her heart racing. She typed back furiously, telling him not to joke about it. But Tom was relentless, teasing her in their group chat, pushing her to say Vincent's name aloud. Eventually, despite her better judgment, Rachel whispered it. Vincent, Vincent, Vincent. At that moment, the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself had responded to her call. She felt a sudden drop in temperature, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Her room plunged into darkness as the lights flickered and went out. Panic surged through her, and she rushed to the window. In the dim light of the storm, she saw a figure standing in the driveway, drenched but unmoving. It was Vincent. His hood was up, his face hidden, but she knew it was him. The way he stood, staring directly at her window, made her blood run cold. Rachel slammed the window shut, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. She ran downstairs, checking every door and window, ensuring they were all locked. As she locked the last door, she glanced outside. Vincent was no longer in the driveway. He was in her yard, standing in the shadows, just a few feet from the back door. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky, and for a brief moment she saw his face clearly through the rain-spattered glass. His sunglasses were gone, revealing sunken, hollow eyes that bore into her soul. She screamed, backing away from the door, unable to take her eyes off the terrifying figure. In a desperate attempt to protect herself, she began to scream the words, "I'm adopted, I'm adopted," hoping it would save her, as it supposedly had others. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't work. There was a sudden knock on the door, loud and forceful. Her heart leapt into her throat as she clutched the kitchen counter for support. The knock came again, slower this time, as if whoever was outside knew they had all the time in the world. Then, silence. The next morning, Rachel woke up on the kitchen floor, unsure of how she had passed out. When she finally mustered the courage to go outside, she found something that sent chills down her spine. Vincent's old, dirty green hoodie, soaked and lying in the middle of her yard. Inside it were several small objects, her missing earrings, a bracelet she thought she'd lost months ago, and a folded piece of paper. Written in shaky, almost childlike handwriting were the words, "You're mine now." That was the last time anyone saw Vincent. He never returned to school, and no one knew what happened to him. But Rachel could never shake the feeling that he was still watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows. To this day, she avoids saying his name, fearful of what might happen if she does. The Watchers of the Forest. The trail was supposed to be easy, the kind you could do alone and return by dusk. John, an avid but amateur hiker, had decided that today was the day to push himself. The trail wound through the dense forest of the Appalachian Mountains, a peaceful place that whispered promises of solitude. John had always loved the quiet, and today he wanted to embrace it fully, alone. The idea of an 8-hour hike seemed exhilarating, a way to disconnect from the bustle of life. The day passed without incident. Trees towered above him, their leaves swaying gently in the mountain breeze. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dancing shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped, and occasionally the rustling of a squirrel breaking through the undergrowth kept him company. John was in his element. Nature felt safe, predictable, and somehow comforting in its isolation. That was until he began his journey back. The sky had begun its slow descent into darkness, deep oranges and purples staining the horizon as John trekked along the path. The once clear trail had become unfamiliar. He paused, scanning his surroundings. Nothing looked right. The trees all seemed to blur together in an indistinguishable mass of green and brown. His heart began to race as he realized he didn't recognize where he was. Panic crept into his chest. "Calm down," he muttered to himself. He took a deep breath and checked his map. He had marked the trail earlier, but somehow everything felt wrong. The terrain no longer matched. He was lost. Night descended quickly, swallowing the forest in darkness. His flashlight flickered as he clicked it on, the beam weak and shaky. With no clear direction, John knew he couldn't wander aimlessly through the woods in the dark. The forest at night was an entirely different beast, dangerous and alive with things he couldn't see. As he tried to gather his thoughts, he stumbled upon something, an old cabin. Hidden behind overgrown bushes and thick vines, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its roof sagged, and the wooden walls were weathered, moss growing up the sides. Yet it was shelter. His flashlight was dying, and the thought of staying in the open terrified him more than the thought of sleeping in a decrepit cabin. At least here, he would have a roof over his head. John approached cautiously, knocking on the door out of courtesy. No response. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness of the night. Inside, the air was stale, and dust hung in the air, swirling in the dim light from his fading flashlight. Despite the decay, the cabin held an eerie kind of order. A single bed stood neatly in the center of the room, perfectly made, as if waiting for someone. John hesitated, but exhaustion clawed at him. After checking the small, single-room cabin, he found no sign of anyone. Surely no one had been here for years. His unease grew as his gaze fell on the walls. Surrounding the room, there were portraits, dozens of them, all in worn frames. The figures in the paintings were strange, their eyes unnervingly wide, mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. They all stared at him, each expression somehow more unsettling than the last. John shuddered, but convinced himself it was just his imagination playing tricks. He had no other choice. He needed to sleep. He lay down on the bed, trying to ignore the faces watching him from every corner. Exhaustion eventually overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. Sometime deep into the night, he awoke suddenly. His skin prickled, as if someone or something was watching him. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft creaking of wood settling in the night. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dark, and with a sense of mounting dread, he realized something was wrong. The portraits, the faces in them, they seemed to have moved. His pulse quickened. He sat up in bed, heart pounding in his chest. In the pale moonlight filtering through the broken window, the faces of the portraits appeared even more menacing. Their smiles seemed wider, their eyes more intense, as though they were actively watching him. Shaking it off as his imagination, John lay back down, trying to calm his nerves. He told himself it was just fatigue, the stress of being lost, but something deep within him screamed that he was not alone. When morning finally came, John sat up, groggy but relieved that the long night had ended. He rubbed his eyes and looked around, expecting to see the unsettling portraits that had disturbed his sleep. But what he saw instead made his blood run cold. There were no paintings. Instead, where the portraits had been, there were windows that had been there all along, windows with no glass, just open holes in the walls. And outside those windows, deep in the shadows of the forest, he could see them, the figures from the paintings. Real, living people standing just outside, staring at him with the same unnatural smiles. John's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. How had he not noticed the windows last night? And the people, no, they couldn't be people. There was something off, something twisted about the way they stood so still, so quiet. He jumped out of the bed, heart hammering in his chest, and backed away from the windows. The figures didn't move, but their eyes never left him. They just stood there, grinning, watching. Without another thought, John bolted for the door. He flung it open and ran. He didn't care where he was going anymore. He just needed to get away from the cabin, from those watchers. The forest closed in around him as he sprinted blindly through the trees. The eerie silence of the woods was broken only by the pounding of his own footsteps and the rasping of his breath. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The patient Dr. Michael Kessler had spent countless nights working the graveyard shift at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. He had grown used to the eerie quiet that settled over the place once the halls were empty and the visiting hours had ended. The hospital, known for its labyrinthine hallways and sprawling wings, was one of the oldest in the city, and its age showed in the creaks and groans of the building as night fell. St. Augustine was an efficient place, but also an unsettling one. The hospital had adopted a color-coded wristband system for its patients. Green meant the patient was alive, yellow indicated they were in critical condition, and red signified the deceased. The system worked smoothly, but the red bands had always unnerved Michael. Whenever he saw them, they were like a constant reminder of the fragility of life. It was on one such late night that Dr. Kessler received a call to fetch supplies from the basement, a task he dreaded. The basement was cold, dimly lit, and perpetually damp. The nurses joked that the basement was where the ghosts of former patients roamed, their spirits unable to leave. Michael, never one for superstition, had always dismissed their stories. But there was something about that night, something about the way the air felt heavier than usual, that made him feel uneasy as he walked toward the elevator. The hallway leading to the elevator was deathly quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he approached the lift, the distant hum of machines the only sound. He pressed the button and waited, the cold steel doors sliding open with a soft ding. Inside the elevator stood a woman, her back to him, looking down at her feet. She appeared to be a patient. Her hospital gown and the plastic bracelet around her wrist made that clear. Michael stepped inside, offering a polite nod to the woman. "Evening," he said, as he pressed the button for the basement. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look up, which was strange, but Michael brushed it off. Patients often wandered the hospital at night to stretch their legs, especially the long-term ones. They had a rule to be back in their rooms by 10, but it wasn't uncommon for someone to push the curfew. As the elevator began its descent, Michael glanced at the woman from the corner of his eye. Something about her felt off, but he couldn't place what it was. Her skin looked pale under the harsh light of the elevator, and her dark hair hung limp around her face. Her eyes, half-lidded, seemed to be staring at nothing in particular. And there was one more thing. She hadn't pressed a button. Michael found that odd. Where was she going? When the elevator finally reached the basement, the doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and Michael stepped forward, ready to retrieve the supplies. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, a man, was limping toward the elevator from the far end of the basement corridor. His movements were slow and labored, his body bent as if under some immense weight. Even from a distance, Michael could see his face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The man's right arm was extended toward the elevator, as if reaching out for help. Panic surged through Michael. His heart raced as he slammed his hand against the button to close the doors. The elevator shuddered, the doors inching shut, just as the man reached them. For a moment, their eyes met, those sunken, lifeless eyes that seemed to bore into Michael's soul. The doors finally clicked shut, and the elevator began its ascent back to the upper floors. Michael leaned against the wall, his chest heaving with each breath. His pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. The image of the man lingered in his mind, the way he had moved like he wasn't fully alive, and then he remembered the wristband. "Why did you do that?" a voice interrupted his thoughts. Michael looked up, startled. It was the woman. She was staring at him now, her eyes sharp and accusing. "That man needed the elevator," she said, her voice cold and calm. "Did you see his wrist?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It was red. He died last night. I would know, because I did his surgery." The woman's expression didn't change, but slowly, she lifted her own arm. Michael's heart stopped. On her wrist, there was a red band. She smiled, a slow, chilling smile that stretched across her face in a way that no smile should. "Like this one?" she asked, her voice low and full of malice. Michael stumbled backward, his mind reeling. His hands shook as he frantically jabbed at the elevator buttons, trying to make the lift move faster, to escape the suffocating presence of the woman. But no matter how many buttons he pressed, the elevator continued its slow, torturous climb. "Who are you?" Michael demanded, his voice rising in fear. The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, her smile never wavering, her eyes locked onto his. As the elevator continued its ascent, the air grew heavier, colder, as if the very life was being drained from the room. Michael's skin prickled, and he could feel the presence of something wrong, something that didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, the lights in the elevator flickered, plunging the small space into darkness. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as the elevator jolted to a stop, the doors refusing to open. In the pitch black, he could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate. And then, her voice, soft and chilling, whispered in the darkness. "We all wear the red band eventually, Doctor." The lights flickered back on, and she was gone. The elevator doors slid open, and Michael stumbled out into the hallway, his legs weak, his mind racing. He looked around, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. He was alone. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their sterile glow on the polished floors. Breathing heavily, Michael staggered to the nurse's station. His hands shook as he gripped the counter, trying to steady himself. "There was a woman in the elevator with me," he stammered. "She had a red band. She shouldn't have been there." The nurse frowned, looking at him with concern. "Doctor, there are no patients with red bands on this floor tonight," she said gently. "All our deceased are in the morgue." Michael's blood ran cold. He knew what he had seen, and he knew who wore red bands. They were not the living. They were the dead. From that night on, Michael Kessler never worked the night shift again. The memory of the woman with the red band, the man in the basement, and the ghostly figures that haunted St. Augustine Memorial lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the thin veil between life and death. And every time he saw a patient with a red wristband, he couldn't help but wonder, were they really gone, or were they still watching, waiting in the shadows for their final goodbye? The door with no number. Jacob Bennett had always enjoyed a fresh start, and this move was no different. After weeks of apartment hunting, he had finally found an affordable place on the outskirts of town. The building wasn't fancy, but it was quiet, well-maintained, and offered him the peace he needed. Eager to settle in, he made his way to the reception desk to pick up the keys to his new apartment. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a stiff smile, handed him the key, but before letting go, she gave him an odd warning. "Welcome to the building, Mr. Bennett, but one thing. There's a door on your floor with no number. Please, don't disturb it, don't knock, don't try to open it, and definitely don't look inside." Jacob raised an eyebrow, perplexed. "Why?" The woman's smile faltered slightly, but she said nothing more, just shaking her head. Jacob, too excited to finally be moving in, shrugged it off. He figured it was just some quirky superstition or an old story residents like to tell. After thanking the receptionist, he made his way to his new apartment. Once inside, Jacob spent the next several hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and making the place feel like home. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that made sounds echo in the hallways, but it had charm. By the time he had finished settling in, it was well into the evening, and the only sound was the occasional hum of an air conditioning unit kicking on somewhere down the hall. But as Jacob sat back on his couch, sipping a drink and letting the tiredness settle over him, he found himself thinking about the receptionist's strange warning. Why would she tell him not to disturb a specific door? What could be behind it? His curiosity piqued. Jacob decided to investigate. He grabbed his keys and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as he walked down the corridor, counting the doors. Apartment 301, 302, and then there it was, an old wooden door with no number. It looked much like the others, but there was something eerie about it. The wood was darker, and the doorknob was dull and rusted, as if it hadn't been used in years. Jacob hesitated, but the temptation was too strong. He reached for the knob and twisted it gently. Locked. Of course. He sighed in mild disappointment, but the curiosity wouldn't leave him. Then an idea struck him. Dropping to his knees, he pressed his eye to the keyhole, peering into the dark apartment on the other side. At first, it was hard to see. His eye adjusted to the dim light in the room beyond, and slowly the details came into view. The apartment was eerily empty. No furniture, no decorations. Just blank, pale walls and a hardwood floor that looked almost untouched. But then, in the far corner of the room, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A woman. She stood with her back to him, facing the wall. Her long, black hair hung down her back, and her skin was ghostly pale, almost translucent. She was perfectly still, unmoving, as if in some kind of trance. Jacob jerked back from the keyhole, a chill running down his spine. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him, as if he had intruded on something private. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? And why was she just standing there, alone in an empty apartment? He forced himself to walk away, determined to forget the strange encounter. But as the night wore on, the image of the woman wouldn't leave his mind. Her pale skin, her long black hair, the unsettling stillness. It gnawed at him. Why had the receptionist warned him? Who was she? The next day, unable to shake his curiosity, Jacob found himself standing in front of the door again. This time, he didn't hesitate. Dropping to his knees, he peeked through the keyhole once more. But instead of the empty room and the woman, all he saw was red. A deep, overwhelming red, as if something was blocking the view. He blinked, confused. Had the woman covered the keyhole? Had she somehow known he was watching her? Disturbed and more than a little shaken, Jacob decided to confront the receptionist. He hurried down to the lobby, his mind buzzing with questions. When he reached the front desk, the receptionist was there, her eyes widening slightly as she saw him approach. "You looked through the keyhole, didn't you?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with disappointment. Jacob hesitated but nodded. Yeah, I did. There was a woman in there yesterday. But today, everything was red. What's going on?" The receptionist let out a long, weary sigh and glanced around to make sure no one else was nearby. "I was hoping you wouldn't get involved," she muttered, shaking her head. "But since you have, I suppose I owe you an explanation." She gestured for him to sit, her expression somber as she began to speak. A long time ago, a couple lived in that apartment. They were unusual, to say the least. The husband was a quiet, unassuming man, but his wife, she was something else. People said there was something wrong with her, that she wasn't quite human. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine, but remained silent, listening intently. They had pale skin, both of them, and long black hair. But the wife, her eyes. People said they were the most striking shade of red, like blood. No one really knew them well, but they were always polite when they passed in the halls. Everything seemed fine, until one night the husband went mad. They say he killed her in a fit of rage, stabbing her repeatedly until the walls were soaked in blood. Jacob swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The receptionist's eyes were cold, distant, as if recalling a memory she had tried to forget. The strange part is, after the murder, the husband vanished. The police never found him, and the wife, well, they say her spirit still lingers. The apartment has been sealed off ever since. That's why I warned you not to disturb it. Jacob sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. The woman he had seen, could she really have been the ghost of the murdered wife? I saw her, Jacob whispered, standing in the corner, and today I saw nothing but red. The receptionist nodded grimly. That's because her eyes are watching you now. Once you've looked through the keyhole, she knows. She sees you just like you saw her. A cold dread settled over Jacob. The thought of those red eyes, burning with rage, following him, waiting for him, made his skin crawl. I suggest you avoid that door from now on, the receptionist said softly. There are some things in this world better left alone. Jacob left the reception desk in a daze, his mind swirling with fear and disbelief. That night, as he lay in bed, every creak and groan of the building seemed louder, more sinister. The darkness pressed in around him, suffocating, and he could feel a presence, something cold and malevolent, watching him from the shadows. And then, just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper at his door. Jacob's blood ran cold as he stared at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn. He didn't dare move. For behind the door with no number, the woman with the red eyes was waiting. The fire beneath the pier. In the quiet coastal town of Clearwater, nestled on the Gulf Coast of Florida, life moved at an unhurried pace. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, and gossip spread like wildfire. One could say that nothing ever truly surprising happened there, until that summer of 2012, when the bizarre and disturbing story of Amanda Dwyer, a 35-year-old schoolteacher, sent shockwaves through the community. Amanda had always been considered a model teacher. At Clearwater Middle School, she was well-liked by students and respected by her colleagues. But something changed in the early months of June. Friends, colleagues, and even some parents started noticing Amanda's odd behavior. It was subtle at first. She became more withdrawn, distant, and preoccupied. She started skipping social events and stopped interacting with people outside of work. Then came the shift in her interests. Amanda, who had never shown any particular interest in spiritual matters, became obsessed with the occult. She spoke vaguely of ancient rituals, purging the soul, and how darkness could be cleansed. Some chalked it up to a midlife crisis, while others dismissed it as just a phase. But no one could have predicted the dark turn her life would take. It wasn't until late June that the true depth of Amanda's unraveling came to light. On the night of June 23rd, Amanda gathered a small group of 7 former students at the Clearwater Pier, a quiet spot known for its stunning views of the sunset. It was an unusual place for a teacher to meet students, especially as dusk fell, but Amanda had always been close with these children. She had tutored them in middle school and had remained a mentor for some time after. Most of them were now in high school, and they trusted her implicitly. So, when she invited them to join her for a special gathering, none of them thought twice. The sun dipped below the horizon as Amanda stood by a small fire she had built near the edge of the pier. The flames flickered in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across her face. The students, seated around her, waited expectantly, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Amanda's voice was calm, almost soothing, as she explained the purpose of the gathering. According to her, the world was filled with dark spirits, demons that could possess and control people without them even realizing it. These demons, she claimed, had latched onto their souls and could only be exorcised through pain and purification. Her words were chilling, but none of the teenagers dared question her. They trusted her, and their loyalty ran deep. Amanda had always been a guiding figure, someone who had shown them kindness and support when they needed it most. But now, in the dim glow of the fire, her demeanor had changed. "We need to rid our bodies of the evil spirits that cling to us," Amanda said, her voice low and steady. "If we don't, they will consume us from the inside. We must release them." The students, confused but too afraid to disobey, watched as Amanda produced a small broken bottle. She instructed them to cut themselves, just small cuts, enough to let the evil spirits out. Hesitantly, one of the boys, Jason, who had always been close to Amanda, agreed to go first. With trembling hands, he took the broken bottle and made a shallow cut on his arm. Blood trickled down his skin, and Amanda smiled approvingly. "Now, we need to seal the wound so the spirits don't come back," she said, holding up a lighter. But as she flicked it, the wind picked up, and the flame sputtered out. Frustrated, Amanda grabbed a bottle of perfume from her bag. Without warning, she doused Jason's hand in the liquid and flicked the lighter again. This time, the flame caught, and Jason's hand ignited in a sudden burst of fire. He screamed, stumbling backward as the flames licked at his skin. The others watched in horror as Amanda calmly patted out the flames, her face emotionless. Jason's hand was red and blistered, the skin peeling where the fire had scorched it. He had suffered second-degree burns, but Amanda showed no concern. She merely nodded, as if satisfied with the outcome. "This is necessary," she said softly. "The pain will cleanse you." Terrified, but unable to break free from her control, the others stayed rooted to the spot. Amanda turned to another student, a girl named Megan, and demanded that she do the same. Megan hesitated, tears welling in her eyes, but Amanda's voice was firm. "You need to let the spirits out, Megan. If you don't, they will destroy you." Megan's hands shook as she picked up the broken bottle. Before she could make the cut, Amanda grabbed the bottle and slashed Megan's neck just below her ear. The cut was shallow, but blood quickly flowed from the wound. Megan gasped in pain, her hand flying to her neck in shock. Without missing a beat, Amanda pulled a small metal key from her pocket and held it over the fire, heating it until it glowed red hot. Then, she pressed the key to Megan's neck, cauterizing the wound with a sickening sizzle. Megan cried out in agony, but Amanda merely watched, her eyes cold and detached. By now, the students were paralyzed with fear. Some wanted to run, but the fear of Amanda's wrath and the hold she seemed to have over them kept them frozen in place. They had always known her as a caring mentor, but tonight, she was someone else entirely. It was only by sheer luck that help arrived. Unbeknownst to Amanda, one of the students, Brian, had told a friend about the gathering earlier that day. Suspicious and uneasy about Amanda's strange behavior, the friend had followed them to the pier and watched from a distance. When he saw what was happening, he ran to a nearby payphone and called the police. When officers arrived, they found Amanda standing by the fire, calmly talking to the terrified students. Jason was cradling his burned hand, and Megan was trembling, blood still oozing from the cauterized wound on her neck. The sight was shocking. A quiet summer evening turned into a scene of horror. Amanda was arrested on the spot, her face blank and emotionless as they led her away in handcuffs. The students were taken to the hospital, where their injuries were treated. None of them spoke to the police immediately. They were too scared, too confused by the events that had transpired. It wasn't until later, when the shock had worn off, that the full story came out. Amanda Dwyer was charged with aggravated battery and child abuse. During her interrogation, she refused to explain what had motivated her actions. Investigators asked her about the rituals, the supposed demons, but Amanda only smiled vaguely, never offering a clear answer. She was locked away, but the scars she left on those 7 students, both physical and emotional, would last a lifetime. As for the community of Clearwater, it would never forget the horror that had unfolded on that warm June night. Amanda Dwyer had once been a respected teacher, but in the end, she became something far more sinister. A woman consumed by dark beliefs, who inflicted pain on those who trusted her most. And though the pier has since been rebuilt, Locals still avoided after dark, whispering of the fire that once burned beneath the stars and the demons that Amanda believed she had set free. The Stalker. In the quiet town of Riverview, Oregon, strange happenings began to unfold in the fall of 2007, an unsettling mystery that would haunt 3 families for months and bring terror to the hearts of everyone in the small community. It all started with a phone call, the first of many that would soon become a nightmare. The Miller family was the first to receive the chilling messages. It was a late October evening when Lisa Miller's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, expecting to see a harmless text or a missed call. Instead, the message read, "I'm watching you. I see you in your yellow sweater, in your kitchen. Say goodbye to your kids." Lisa's hands shook as she read the words, her heart pounding in her chest. The message described her down to every detail. The yellow sweater she had been wearing all day, her position at the kitchen counter, and even her 2 young daughters who were playing in the living room just a few feet away. She scanned the room in a panic, her mind racing. There was no one there, but the phone didn't lie. Someone had been watching her. That night was just the beginning. The calls and messages began to come at all hours, often in the dead of night when the family was asleep. Each time, the anonymous voice on the other end would speak in a scratchy, distorted tone, threatening to kill Lisa, her husband David, and their daughters. The caller seemed to know everything about them, what they were wearing, where they were going, and even private conversations they had in their home. Lisa, terrified and desperate, contacted the local police. Detective John Keller was assigned to the case, and though he was initially skeptical, the evidence was too disturbing to ignore. The caller left voicemails with recordings of the Millers' conversations, including a private discussion between Lisa and Keller himself during one of their meetings at the police station. The calls continued, even when the Millers' phones were switched off. Things escalated when the Simmons family, who lived just a few blocks away, started receiving similar calls. The messages followed the same eerie pattern: details about their lives, threats against their children, and an uncanny knowledge of their daily activities. One particularly chilling message described what their teenage son, Ethan, had been doing the previous night. The voice spoke of how Ethan had stayed up late in his room, scrolling through his phone and listening to music, unaware that he was being watched. The final family to be targeted was the Johnsons. Laura Johnson, a local teacher, received a voicemail that made her blood run cold. The voice, raspy and malevolent, told her that her mother, who lived with them, would die that night unless she followed specific instructions. Laura frantically called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of the caller. Her mother, unharmed but shaken, hadn't heard a thing. The police were at a loss. Detective Keller and his team launched an investigation, but every lead came to a dead end. They tried tracing the calls, only to discover that they were coming from the victims' own phones, even when those phones were turned off. It was as though the stalker had gained access to the devices, turning them into tools of terror. Worse yet, the calls and messages continued to pour in, despite the police's best efforts to track the perpetrator. Frustration mounted as Keller turned to tech experts for answers. But the findings were disturbing. It appeared that the caller was exploiting some kind of advanced hacking technique, using the victims' cell phones not just to make calls, but to spy on them in real time. The phone's cameras and microphones were being accessed remotely, allowing the stalker to watch and listen to everything the families did, even in their most private moments. The town of Riverview buzzed with fear. Rumors swirled that the culprit was some tech-savvy criminal or a twisted hacker with too much power. Others believed it was something more sinister, something beyond the grasp of human understanding. The more superstitious whispered about dark forces, spirits who could inhabit machines and control them from the shadows. As the weeks passed, the Millers, Simmonses, and Johnsons became prisoners in their own homes. They changed their routines, avoiding leaving the house whenever possible, and lived in constant fear of the next phone call. The Millers even installed security cameras and motion detectors around their home, but the cameras caught nothing out of the ordinary. The sense of being watched, however, never left them. Then, Just as mysteriously as it had begun, the calls stopped. For a brief period, the families dared to hope that it was all over. Perhaps the stalker had grown bored, or maybe the police investigation had scared them off. But then, a new threat emerged. In December of that year, the Connors family moved into a sprawling house in a wealthier part of town. It was an expensive property, bought with the life savings of John and Megan Connors, who hoped it would be the perfect place to raise their 2 children. But shortly after moving in, they started receiving letters from someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letters were unlike anything they had ever seen. The Watcher claimed that their new home had been under surveillance for decades, and that they were simply the latest family to live there. "I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming," one letter read. Another, more menacing letter asked, "Have you found out what's hidden in the walls yet?" The Connors family, alarmed, contacted the police, but no evidence was found to suggest who might be behind the letters. They received several more messages over the following weeks, each one more disturbing than the last. "I am pleased to know your children's names now," read one particularly chilling letter, "and the name of the young blood you have brought to me." Desperate to protect their children, the Connorses fled the house and filed a lawsuit against the previous owners, accusing them of failing to disclose the unsettling history of the property. But the Watcher was never found. The fear that had gripped Riverview spread to other nearby towns. Stories of stalkers and watchers began to emerge from other places, fueling speculation that the town itself was cursed. For the Miller, Simmons, and Johnson families, the scars from those terrifying months would never fade. The constant surveillance, the threats, and the feeling of helplessness lingered long after the phone calls stopped. To this day, the mystery of the Riverview phone stalker remains unsolved. Some believe it was the work of a deranged hacker with a twisted agenda. Others think it was something far darker, a malevolent force that used technology to feed on fear. Whatever the truth, the legend of the phone stalker is still told in Riverview, a chilling reminder that even in the digital age, we are never truly alone. The haunting of Fairview Lodge. The Fairview Lodge had stood proudly in the small town of Silver Creek, Oregon, for over a century. Built in 1910 as a luxurious retreat for the wealthy, the sprawling mountain lodge became a symbol of opulence, drawing in elite guests who sought the serene beauty of the surrounding wilderness. But by the 1970s, the grandeur of the Fairview had faded, its once glamorous halls now echoing with emptiness. The lodge fell into disrepair, its charm lost to time. For decades, rumors had swirled about the lodge's haunted reputation. Guests spoke of strange sounds, flickering lights, and shadows that moved where no one stood. The locals of Silver Creek kept their distance, convinced the lodge had become a resting place for restless spirits. Despite the rumors, it wasn't until the late 1980s, when a famous author wrote a chilling novel inspired by the lodge, that the ghost stories reached national attention. Soon, tourists from around the world flocked to Silver Creek, eager to spend a night in the haunted lodge that had inspired one of the scariest books of the 20th century. By 2016, Fairview Lodge had regained some of its former glory. It was fully restored, its once decaying walls now bright with fresh paint, and its rooms once again filled with curious visitors. Henry Cho, a resident of Portland, Oregon, had always been fascinated by ghost stories, so when he found himself with a few days off in April, he decided to book a last-minute getaway to Silver Creek. His goal? To see if the legends about Fairview Lodge were true. "I had heard about the place for years," Henry said later. "I figured, why not see if it's really as haunted as everyone says?" Henry arrived at the lodge on a sunny afternoon. The building was impressive, its old-world charm still intact, despite its eerie reputation. After checking in, Henry had dinner in the lodge's grand dining hall, an elegant space with high ceilings, chandeliers, and large windows that overlooked the mountain range. The food was excellent, but it wasn't the cuisine that Henry was here for. After finishing his meal, he grabbed his camera and decided to explore. Wandering through the halls, Henry was struck by the stillness of the place. Though the lodge was bustling with guests, there was a strange hush that seemed to hang over everything. He made his way to the grand staircase, one of the most famous features of Fairview Lodge, and waited patiently for other tourists to clear the area. Once he had the space to himself, he took a photo of the empty staircase, its wooden banisters gleaming in the dim light. Satisfied, he continued to explore. But something changed that evening. As the sun began to set, Henry started to feel unwell. At first, it was just a mild discomfort, an uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. But as the evening progressed, the sensation grew worse. A chill settled over him, and despite the warmth of the lodge, he couldn't stop shivering. "I felt really sick," he recalled later. "I had the shivers, and there was this overwhelming sense that something was wrong." His travel companion, worried by his sudden illness, urged him to go to the emergency room, but Henry refused, chalking it up to exhaustion from the drive or maybe something he had eaten. He decided to sleep it off and headed to bed early that night, hoping he would feel better in the morning. But sleep brought no relief. Throughout the night, Henry was plagued by disturbing dreams, shadowy figures moving through his room, strange voices whispering his name, and a suffocating presence that weighed heavily on his chest. He woke several times, drenched in cold sweat, his heart racing. The next morning, exhausted and still feeling unwell, Henry decided to cut his trip short. On the drive back to Portland, he scrolled through the photos he had taken at the lodge, hoping to distract himself from the lingering sense of unease. Most of the images were ordinary, shots of the lodge's beautiful architecture, the surrounding mountains, and the grand dining hall. But then he came to the photo of the staircase. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. But as he zoomed in, his heart skipped a beat. There, at the base of the staircase, was the unmistakable outline of a figure that hadn't been there when he took the photo. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face pale and expressionless. She seemed to be staring directly at the camera, her eyes dark and hollow. Henry's blood ran cold as he stared at the image, his mind racing. He had been alone when he took that photo. There had been no one else in the hallway. And yet, here she was, standing in the shot, as clear as day. Trying to calm his nerves, Henry rationalized that it could have been a trick of the light, a strange reflection, or maybe even another guest he hadn't noticed. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. That night, back in Portland, Henry posted the photo on Instagram with a half-joking caption about capturing a ghost. He didn't think much of it until the next morning when his phone exploded with notifications. The photo had gone viral, attracting the attention of media outlets and paranormal experts from around the world. People flooded the comments with their theories. Some claimed it was a genuine ghost, while others suggested it was an elaborate prank. Paranormal experts analyzed the image and came to conflicting conclusions. Some believed the figure was a manifestation of an actual spirit, while others thought it was the result of the ghost trying to materialize, draining Henry of his energy and causing his illness. There was another, more chilling theory, that the ghost wasn't alone. "If you look closely," one paranormal investigator wrote, "you can see a second figure behind her in the shadows." The thought of not one, but two spirits haunting the staircase sent shivers down Henry's spine. And it wasn't just the photo that unsettled him. It was the knowledge that he had felt something that night. The sickness, the dreams, the overwhelming feeling of dread, it all seemed to connect to the moment he had taken that photo. For weeks after the trip, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of his vision, hear faint whispers when he was alone, and feel that same suffocating presence he had experienced at the lodge. His sleep was plagued by nightmares, always of the woman at the staircase, her dark eyes following him wherever he went. Henry's encounter at Fairview Lodge became a sensation, and the photo was examined by countless experts. But despite all the attention, no one could explain exactly what had happened that night, or why Henry had fallen ill after taking the picture. To this day, the lodge remains a popular destination for those seeking a brush with the supernatural. And though Henry has never returned, the memory of that night, the ghostly woman, the sickness, the shadows, still haunts him. He never did find out who or what had been watching him from the staircase. But he knew one thing for certain: some things, once seen, can never be forgotten. The last passenger. Maya had always loved night drives, the empty roads cutting through desolate stretches of countryside. The peace, the quiet, those were her moments of escape. She enjoyed the freedom, feeling the hum of the engine beneath her and the soft, whispering sound of wind as it raced by. Tonight, however, something felt off. It was just after midnight, and she was driving down a road she hadn't taken before. She had been following the map on her phone for what felt like hours, though her destination, a quaint little inn she had found online, was nowhere to be seen. Her phone's GPS had started flickering an hour ago, and now it was completely dead. There was no signal either, leaving her stranded on this seemingly endless road. Her stomach twisted with unease. Ahead, a sign emerged from the darkness, its words barely visible in the dull light of her headlights. Last exit, 20 miles. She sighed in frustration. Just then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure standing at the side of the road, right in the narrow strip between her car and the trees that lined the highway. A man, his arm raised in a hitchhiking gesture. Maya slowed down instinctively, her heart racing. Who was hitchhiking at this hour, in the middle of nowhere? As she passed him, her headlights illuminated his face. He was tall, wearing a heavy coat despite the warm summer air, his face pale and his eyes hollow. A deep pit formed in her stomach, and she pressed the gas pedal harder, deciding against stopping. Several miles passed, and she kept looking into her rearview mirror, expecting to see him vanish in the distance. But then, there he was again. Her blood turned cold. The same man, standing by the road, his thumb out, his hollow gaze piercing her, even through the dark. It was impossible. There were no other exits, no side roads he could have taken. How could he be ahead of her? Maya gripped the steering wheel tightly, refusing to stop. Her breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting back to the mirror. He disappeared behind her once more, but something told her this wasn't over. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky. She hadn't noticed the storm clouds that were rolling in, casting an even deeper gloom over the road. A flash of lightning revealed the man again, this time standing in the middle of the road just ahead of her. She slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest as the car screeched to a stop inches away from him. She froze, her eyes locked onto his. He stood there, unmoving, as though daring her to get out. Her skin crawled with fear, and for a moment, she considered reversing and getting the hell out of there. But before she could react, he walked around to the passenger side door and opened it without hesitation, climbing in. "Drive," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the door shutting with a quiet thud. Maya's pulse raced. She stared straight ahead, hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but something about him felt inevitable, as though she had no choice but to comply. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain that had begun to pour down. "Doesn't matter," he replied, his eyes fixed ahead. "Just drive and don't stop." The command sent chills down her spine, but she did as he said. She drove, the darkness closing in around them as the rain lashed against the windshield. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her, the road disappearing into the inky blackness beyond the reach of her headlights. The man sat in silence, his presence suffocating. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, his face hidden in the shadows. But Maya could feel him watching her, his eyes burning into her. After what felt like hours, the man finally broke the silence. "They don't like the light, you know." Maya glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "The things in the dark. They don't like the light." Her stomach twisted in knots. What was he talking about? She had the overwhelming urge to pull over, to demand answers. But the man's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't stop." The road twisted ahead, and as they rounded a bend, her headlights caught something moving in the distance. A shape, several shapes. It looked like animals at first, hunched over and crawling on all fours. But as they got closer, Maya realized these things were not animals at all. They were humanoid, with long, twisted limbs and glowing, empty eyes that locked onto the car as it approached. Their mouths opened unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. One of them lunged toward the car, slamming its body against the passenger side door. Maya screamed, swerving to avoid it as the creature let out an ear-piercing screech. "Keep driving," the man growled, his tone commanding. "Don't stop." Her hands were shaking violently now, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. She didn't know what those things were, but the thought of stopping, of letting them catch up, sent waves of terror crashing over her. The road seemed endless, the creatures pacing the car, their bodies illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. The rain was relentless, blurring everything outside the car into one terrifying mass of darkness. Maya's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, refusing to slow down. "What are they?" she finally managed to ask, her voice shaking. The man was silent for a long moment before responding. "They're the ones who didn't make it." Her heart sank. "Didn't make it? Make it where?" "They were like you once," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "On the road, driving, lost, but they didn't listen." Maya's stomach lurched. She couldn't understand what he meant, but every instinct told her that if she stopped, she would join them. The things outside slammed into the car again, their screeches filling the night air. Just ahead, a dim glow appeared through the rain, a sign of some kind. She squinted through the water running down the windshield. The words "Final Exit" flashed before the sign disappeared into the rearview mirror. The man shifted slightly, his eyes glancing toward the glow. "You have one last chance," he said, his voice cold. "Once you pass the final exit, there's no going back." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't stop. Not now. The man leaned forward, his hollow eyes locking onto her. "Make your choice, but make it soon." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she pressed down on the gas pedal, the final exit growing closer. The creatures outside were shrieking louder, their twisted bodies keeping pace with the car. As she sped past the sign, a terrible guttural growl rose from the darkness behind her. The things that had chased her suddenly stopped, retreating into the blackness as if they were forbidden from crossing the threshold. Maya glanced at the man in the passenger seat, but he was gone. The seat was empty, the door closed, as if he had never been there at all. She kept driving, tears streaming down her face, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The road stretched out ahead of her, empty and endless, but now she was completely alone. The silent woods. Jake's truck rumbled along the isolated dirt road, its headlights slicing through the pitch-black night. His hands were tense on the wheel as the trees on either side grew thicker, their twisted branches reaching overhead like skeletal arms. This was no ordinary forest. It was the Silent Woods, so named for the eerie, unnatural quiet that lingered there. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of insects. Just silence. He had heard the rumors about the place, tales passed down from locals about people disappearing, strange sounds, and sightings of something lurking in the woods. But Jake was a skeptic. He worked as a freelance photographer, always chasing that next story, that perfect shot. When he'd heard about the Silent Woods, he thought it would make for a great series, showcase the strange and eerie atmosphere, and maybe dispel the ridiculous myths once and for all. After hours of driving and nothing but darkness around him, Jake finally saw the old cabin, a flickering glow from its single window signaling the end of his journey. He'd rented it from an old man who lived in town, the only place to stay in this remote part of the forest. The man had warned him, of course. "You best be leaving at the first light," the old man had said, his eyes dark and serious. Silent woods don't take kindly to strangers lingering after dark. Jake had laughed it off then, but now, staring at the cabin and the oppressive woods that surrounded it, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He grabbed his camera bag, his flashlight, and the food supplies he had packed, then stepped out of the truck. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his jacket. The forest loomed over him, the trees taller than he'd imagined, the silence deafening. He could hear his own breath, his heartbeat, the crunch of the gravel beneath his boots, but beyond that, nothing. After settling into the small, musty cabin, Jake set out to scout the area. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in shadow. His flashlight beam barely pierced the blackness, but it was enough to capture the edges of trees and broken branches. With his camera ready, he started snapping pictures. The silence was unsettling, more intense than he had anticipated. No wind, no distant hoot of an owl. It was as though the forest had swallowed every sound, trapping it within the towering trees. As he ventured deeper into the woods, Jake's unease grew. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to go to the safety of the cabin. But he pushed forward, determined to shake off his irrational fear. There was nothing out here, just trees and shadows. Then he heard it. A soft rustling behind him, so faint he almost thought he imagined it. He stopped, listening, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The rustling stopped too. He turned around, the light sweeping across the trees, illuminating nothing but bark and brambles. Jake shook his head, laughing nervously to himself. "It's just nerves," he muttered, pressing forward. But as he moved, so did the rustling. It wasn't an animal. He was certain of that. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated, following his every step. He stopped again, this time whipping around quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing, only darkness. His skin crawled, and his pulse quickened. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Determined not to be rattled by the dark, he pushed on. Yet the feeling of being watched, followed, grew stronger. His mind started racing, conjuring images of the things the locals had warned him about. Dark shapes, figures in the woods, stalking those who dared enter after nightfall. His flashlight flickered, then dimmed. Jake froze. No, he muttered, tapping it desperately. The light sputtered back to life for a moment, then blinked out entirely, plunging him into absolute darkness. For a long moment, he stood completely still, holding his breath, listening, and then he heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it was closer, much closer. His heart hammered against his chest as his eyes strained to adjust to the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches twisting like claws in the shadows. "Hello," Jake called, his voice cracking with fear. The silence swallowed his words, offering no echo, no response. Suddenly, something cold brushed against the back of his neck. Jake yelped, spinning around, only to find empty space. His breathing was ragged now, panic setting in. He had to get back to the cabin. He had to get out of these woods. He started walking quickly, trying to remember which direction he had come from, but everything looked the same. His mind was a blur, his feet stumbling over roots and stones. The rustling followed, louder now, as though something was rushing through the trees, closing in on him. He broke into a run, his legs pumping, his breath coming in short gasps. Branches whipped at his face, his arms, but he didn't care. He had to get out. He had to. A shadow darted across his path, just ahead. Jake skidded to a halt, his heart slamming against his ribcage. He could barely make out the shape, a tall, dark figure standing just beyond the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the pitch-black night. The figure moved toward him, slow and deliberate. Jake turned and ran in the opposite direction, not caring where he was going, only that he needed to escape. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. The rustling followed, faster now, accompanied by faint, heavy breathing, as though whatever was chasing him was closing in. The cabin, it came into view, its dim glow barely visible through the trees. Jake surged forward, hope rising in his chest. But just as he reached the clearing, something cold and sharp grabbed his ankle, yanking him to the ground. He hit the dirt hard, his head spinning, pain shooting through his body. He scrambled to his feet, but whatever had grabbed him still held tight, dragging him backward. He kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The force was too strong, pulling him into the shadows. And then he saw it. A face. Pale, gaunt, eyes hollow and black, lips twisted into a grotesque smile. The thing was human, or it had been once. But now it was something else, something monstrous. Its fingers dug into his skin, sharp as knives, its breath rancid and cold. Jake screamed, his voice echoing through the silent woods. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the figure's smile growing wider, its eyes gleaming with hunger. The next morning, the old man from town drove out to the cabin to check on Jake, as he had promised. But when he arrived, the truck was there, parked and untouched, the cabin door wide open. He called out for Jake but received no answer. The old man knew better than to step into the woods. He had seen too many people vanish without a trace. With a heavy sigh, he got back into his car and drove away, leaving the silent woods to claim its newest victim. No one ever found Jake's body. Just like the others before him, he had disappeared, becoming another story, another warning for those foolish enough to venture into the silent woods after dark. But sometimes, on quiet nights, you can still hear the rustling of leaves in the windless air, and the faint, desperate cry of someone who never made it out. The terror on Raven Trail. I just wanted a peaceful weekend, a break from work, people, and the constant noise. The past few months had been a relentless grind, and I craved solitude. So I decided to head out for a quick camping trip. I found this place online, a remote spot called Raven Trail, tucked away deep in the forests of Oregon. The site was advertised as quiet, isolated, and far enough off the beaten path to guarantee solitude, perfect for what I needed. I left early in the morning, and by mid-afternoon I was there. The drive to Raven Trail was eerie in itself. The highway gradually disappeared into a winding dirt road, trees towering on either side, their branches knitting together overhead. There was no one around, no other cars, no hikers, no one. I finally reached the clearing. It was a small patch of land surrounded by dense forest, and I could just barely hear the distant hum of a river somewhere far off. It was perfect, just me and nature. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire pit, and began to settle in for what I thought would be a relaxing weekend. But as I unpacked, something caught my eye. A metallic glint in the grass near the base of a tree. At first I thought it was trash, maybe an old beer can left by a careless camper. But when I bent down to pick it up, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small camera, the kind you see used for wildlife tracking, except it wasn't mounted to anything. It just lay there, half buried in the dirt, facing directly toward my campsite. I figured maybe someone had dropped it or forgotten it, so I picked it up. That's when I saw the tiny red light blinking on the side. The camera was on. Everything was being filmed. My first instinct was to drop it, but curiosity got the better of me. I examined it closely. It was a modern, high-tech model, and it was actively recording. My stomach churned. Why? Why would someone set up a camera in the middle of the forest, right where I was camping? It did not make any sense at all. Everything pointed towards something sinister. I told myself it was nothing, a misplaced wildlife camera, or maybe part of a research project. But still, something about it felt off. I was not convinced at all with my self-conviction effort. Then I saw another one. This one was up in a tree, cleverly hidden, its lens aimed directly at me. Now it was as clear as daylight. The object of the recording was me. My heart began to race. 2 cameras. What were the chances? This wasn't just an accident. I was being watched. I was sure about that. The burning question was, by who and why? Why would someone want to watch me, stalk me? What were his or their intentions? I quickly glanced around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The wind rustled the leaves, but otherwise, everything was still. Too still. I shoved the camera into my backpack and walked the perimeter of my campsite, my nerves on edge. That's when I noticed a third camera, this one farther back in the woods, almost hidden under a pile of leaves. Someone had deliberately placed these cameras here. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the rational part of my brain kept whispering that I was overreacting. Maybe it was some weird prank or a forgotten research project. I decided to stay, just for one night. I would keep an eye out and leave first thing in the morning. But as I sat by the campfire later that evening, the unease wouldn't go away. The sun had set, and the sky was an angry swirl of dark clouds, threatening a storm. The wind had picked up, and the sound of distant thunder rumbled through the trees. The fire crackled, but the warmth did little to calm my nerves. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed through the forest, like the sound of a branch breaking. I froze. The sound was too close. I strained to hear anything else, but there was only the rustling of leaves in the growing wind. Then, another snap, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Someone was out there. I shot up from the fire, my eyes darting toward the tree line. A shadowy figure stood just beyond the reach of the firelight, half hidden by the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. "Hey, who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaky. No response. The figure didn't move an inch. My heart pounded against my ribs as I stared, trying to make out any details. But all I could see was the silhouette, barely visible in the dim light of the fire. Thunder cracked, and suddenly the sky opened up. Rain began to pour down in heavy sheets, dousing the fire and plunging the clearing into near-total darkness. I scrambled to grab my flashlight, fumbling with it as water soaked through my clothes. When I finally switched it on and pointed it toward the trees, the figure was gone. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there. The cameras, the figure, something was very wrong. I quickly gathered my things, shoving them haphazardly into my backpack. My hands trembled as I tried to pack up my tent, the rain making everything slippery and difficult to handle. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Closer this time. I swung the flashlight around, my breath catching in my throat. The beam of light caught a glimpse of movement. Another figure, this one just a few feet away, standing at the edge of the clearing. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene for a split second, and I saw them clearly. Two figures, their faces obscured by the shadows, standing there in the pouring rain. Panic surged through me. I abandoned my tent, grabbed my car keys, and sprinted toward my car, slipping in the mud as I went. The rain was coming down so hard now that I could barely see, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I reached the car, threw my gear in the back, and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to get the key into the ignition. After what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the clearing, my tires slipping on the wet dirt road. As I sped down the narrow trail, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures chasing after me. But there was nothing. Just the rain and the dark, winding road. My heart was still racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small town miles away, drenched and exhausted. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station and sat there for a while, trying to catch my breath, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I don't know who those people were or why they were watching me. I don't know what they wanted, and frankly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never set foot on Raven Trail or any other secluded camping spot ever again. The Creature of Blackthorn Hill. My name is Nolan Winters, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in 1998. I was 27, living in a quiet little town called Blackthorn Hill, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Blackthorn Hill was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life moved slowly. I worked as a mechanic, fixing up trucks and snowmobiles. On weekends, I enjoyed hiking and fishing in the woods that surrounded the town. It was a peaceful life, until that summer. It was late July when the tranquility of Blackthorn Hill was shattered by the disappearance of a visitor. His name was Aaron Keene, a journalist from New York who'd come to write an article about small-town life. He'd been in Blackthorn Hill for about a week, chatting with the locals and soaking in the mountain air. Then one morning, Aaron set off for a hike up to Hawk's Talon Ridge and never returned. I didn't know Aaron well, but we'd shared a few beers at the local bar, the Rusty Axe, a couple of nights before he vanished. He seemed like a decent guy, curious, full of stories about the places he'd been. His disappearance unnerved everyone in town, and soon enough, search parties were organized to comb the woods for any sign of him. A week after Aaron went missing, Sheriff Caldwell called me. Given my familiarity with the terrain, he asked if I could help with the search. I agreed, figuring it was the least I could do. The next morning, I met up with a small search party at the edge of the forest. About 10 of us, including the sheriff, his deputy, and 2 of Aaron's friends who had come from New York. We split into pairs to cover more ground. I was teamed up with a guy named Carl, big, broad-shouldered, and always wearing a flannel shirt like he just stepped out of a logging camp. Carl was a longtime friend, and the 2 of us had spent more time together in these woods than I could count. As we headed up the trail, the familiar scent of pine and wet earth filled the air. But the silence that hung over the forest that day, it wasn't the usual peaceful quiet. It was oppressive, heavy, with something I couldn't quite name. We'd been hiking for a few hours when we came across something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a patch of ground where the underbrush had been flattened, like something or someone had fallen there. Nearby, a piece of torn fabric hung on a thorn bush. It looked like it might have come from Aaron's jacket. Nkathet. We called out for him, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. We marked the spot and radioed the sheriff. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered overhead, and the forest grew darker. Not wanting to get caught in a storm, Carl and I decided to take a different route back, hoping to cover some new ground. That's when we found something I'll never forget. A cave. The entrance was barely visible, hidden by a thick tangle of vines. We might have walked right past it if Carl hadn't spotted it. It wasn't wide, just big enough for a person to slip through. We exchanged a glance, both thinking the same thing. Maybe Aaron had taken shelter here, but the unease in my gut told me we shouldn't go in. "Think he's in there?" I asked, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Only one way to find out," Carl said, pulling out his flashlight. We ducked into the cave, Carl's flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. It was cold inside, the air damp and stale. We moved cautiously, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. After a few minutes, the narrow passage opened into a larger chamber. That's when we saw it, Aaron's body. He was sprawled on the cold stone floor, his face drained of all color, eyes wide open in an expression of sheer terror. His clothes were torn, and there were deep, jagged scratches all over his arms and neck. But it wasn't just the sight of his body that made my blood run cold. It was the thing standing over him. At first, I thought it was a man, a tall figure hunched over Aaron's lifeless body. But as Carl's flashlight beam settled on it, I realized with horror that it was something else entirely. Its skin was pale, almost gray, stretched thin over its bony frame. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in fingers that looked more like claws. And its eyes, sickly yellow, glowing in the dark like the eyes of a predator. Carl let out a low curse, backing up a step. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "But we need to get out of here." We moved slowly at first, not wanting to draw its attention. But as soon as we reached the cave's narrow entrance, we ran. The rain had started by the time we got outside, but we didn't stop. We didn't speak. We just ran as fast as we could until we were back at the trailhead. When we finally caught our breath, we radioed the sheriff. He arrived with his deputies a few minutes later. Carl and I told them what we'd seen, but when the sheriff and his men returned from the cave, they claimed there was no sign of the creature. They found Aaron's body, all right, but whatever had been standing over him was gone. The sheriff urged us to keep quiet about what we saw. He didn't want to cause a panic, said it was probably just an animal attack. But I knew better. So did Carl. In the days that followed, life in Blackthorn Hill returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the town felt different, tenser, more cautious. People didn't go hiking as much anymore. Kids weren't allowed to roam the woods freely. The local businesses suffered as fewer tourists came through. Then, a few weeks later, another hiker went missing. This time, it was a young woman named Alice, a local. They found her body in a different part of the woods, mutilated in the same way as Aaron's. Once again, the sheriff called it an animal attack, but by then the whole town was on edge. Karen was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I started having nightmares, always the same thing, those yellow eyes staring at me from the dark. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the memory of that cave never far from my mind. One evening, Carl showed up at my house. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him. Dark circles under his eyes, his face pale. He sat down on my porch, lit a cigarette, and stared off into the distance for a long time before speaking. "I've been seeing it," he said quietly. "Out in the woods. Not up close. But I catch glimpses. It's still out there, Nolan." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. The next day, we went to Sheriff Caldwell, told him what Carl had seen and what I'd been dreaming about. The sheriff was skeptical, but he agreed to help us organize one last search, just the three of us. We set out at dawn, rifles slung over our shoulders, flashlights in hand, and ventured deep into the woods, back to that cursed cave. When we got there, the air inside was colder than before. As we stepped into the larger chamber, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. The creature. This time, we didn't run. We raised our rifles, but before we could fire, the thing moved, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It lunged at Carl, knocking him to the ground. The sheriff and I opened fire, the shots echoing in the cave like thunder. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and collapsed. We didn't stick around to see if it was dead. We grabbed Carl and got out of there as fast as we could. I haven't been back to Blackthorn Hill since. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about those yellow eyes watching from the dark. The Hunter's Nightmare. My name is Owen Gray Hawk, and this event still haunts me. It was in 2013, and I was living on the northern Blackfoot Reservation in Montana. Growing up on the reservation, we were immersed in stories of spirits, creatures, and strange happenings. Some were meant to teach lessons, but others, those were the ones that made your skin crawl. My life was simple, filled with family traditions, hunting trips, and the occasional village gathering. But that summer, something far from simple happened. It started when I got a call from my old friend Derek Red Cloud. We hadn't spoken much since high school, but he knew about my hunting skills and tracking experience. He invited me on a hunting trip with a few of his friends in the Bitterroot Mountains. I figured it would be a nice break, a chance to reconnect with Derek and enjoy the wilderness, so I agreed. Early one morning, Derek pulled up in his beat-up pickup truck, and we hit the road. The drive was long, taking us deep into the forested mountains, but the conversation flowed easily. We talked about our lives, the old days, and the things that changed since we'd last seen each other. After a few hours, we met up with his friends, Ben and Tom, at a remote gas station. Ben was a quiet, serious type, while Tom, on the other hand, was the clown, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. We continued driving, leaving the main road for a narrow dirt path that twisted through the thick trees. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. After what seemed like an eternity, we reached a clearing where we decided to set up camp. The plan was to spend a few days hunting deer, but Derek mentioned that wild turkeys were also abundant in the area. The first day went without incident. We scouted the area, set up some trail cameras, and enjoyed a night around the campfire. We shared stories, mostly about life, a few about strange things we'd heard growing up on the reservation. There was an eerie calm to the forest. It was so quiet that you could hear the faintest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire. We laughed it off and went to bed, but I had a strange feeling in my gut. The next morning, we split up into pairs. Derek and Ben went one way, while Tom and I took another trail. We walked for hours, following tracks and looking for signs of game, but the animals seemed to be hiding. As the sun dipped low in the sky, we started making our way back to camp. That's when it happened. A scream echoed through the trees. A human scream, not an animal's cry. Tom and I exchanged a glance and ran toward the sound. As we got closer, the trees seemed to close in, the light fading quicker than it should. When we finally burst into the clearing, we found Derek and Ben standing over something. I couldn't see clearly at first, but as I moved closer, my stomach twisted. It was a body, or what was left of one. Torn apart, limbs shredded, and blood soaking into the earth. Derek's face was ashen, his hands shaking. "We found him like this," he he whispered. None of us moved, all paralyzed by what we were seeing. Om tried to call for help, but of course, there was no signal out, hands shaking. We need to cover him up and get back to the truck, Ben said, his voice tight. We'll get a signal there. We dragged a tarp over the remains and started the trek back, but every step felt heavier than the last. Every sound made us flinch. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on us, though I saw nothing. By the time we reached the truck, Derek managed to get a weak signal and called the authorities. They told us to stay put while they sent someone. The wait was agonizing. We huddled around a small fire, backs to each other, rifles in hand. The night was unnaturally quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, the headlights of a sheriff's truck cut through the darkness. Sheriff Joel Hawkins, an older man with a deep frown, took our statements. He pulled me aside, his voice low. You ever seen something like this? No, I said, still shaken. This isn't an animal. No bear could do that. He nodded grimly. We'll be doing an investigation, but you boys should head back to town. Leave this to us. We packed up quickly and drove back to the gas station in silence. The weight of what we'd seen hung over us like a dark cloud. We promised to stay in touch, but I knew that none of us would be forgetting this anytime soon. For the next week, sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that body, ripped apart, lifeless. The worst part was the feeling that whatever did it was still out there, watching. One night, Derek called me. Owen, he said, his voice shaking. They found another body. Same thing, torn to shreds. A knot formed in my stomach. What do we do? We need to go back, he said, figure out what's going on. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at Derek's cabin near the edge of the reservation. Ben and Tom were there too, looking as worn out as I felt. We gathered our gear, loaded our rifles, and headed back to the mountains. The forest felt different this time, oppressive. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound more sinister. We split up again, staying within earshot, but as the hours passed, we found nothing. Just as we were about to head back, a foul stench hit me, a smell so rancid it made me gag. It was faint, but unmistakable. Suddenly, Ben shouted. I ran toward his voice, heart pounding, and when I reached him, he was standing over another body. Fresh, blood still pooling around it. His face was pale, his eyes wide. What's doing this? He whispered. Before I could answer, a noise came from the trees behind us. We spun around, rifles raised, and in the dim light, we saw something moving. It was fast, unnaturally fast, darting between the trees like a shadow. We fired, but it didn't stop. We chased it, driven by fear and adrenaline, deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer. We lost sight of the creature, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Then Derek screamed. We turned to see him on the ground, clutching his leg, blood seeping through his fingers. Whatever that thing was, it had struck him and disappeared into the darkness. We had no choice but to haul Derek back to the truck. The drive to the hospital was a blur, Derek's condition worsening with every passing minute. At the hospital, the doctors were baffled. His wounds looked like animal bites, but they couldn't identify the species. After we gave our statements to the authorities, they promised to investigate further, but I could tell they were as terrified as we were. Weeks passed, and the forest was silent. No more bodies were found, but the fear never left. Derek recovered physically, but he was a different person after that. Withdrawn, haunted. None of us ever spoke about that night again, and we drifted apart, each of us carrying the weight of what we'd seen. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. The forest no longer feels like home, it feels like a trap. I rarely go hunting anymore, and when I do, I never go alone, because I know that somewhere, in the shadows, something is watching, waiting for its next victim.